Everyone in the village believed Lydia had betrayed the pack. Overnight, the kindest woman they knew became the one no one was willing to defend. As fear spread faster than the truth, only one man refused to judge her without asking a single question first: the Alpha King. If you love stories about powerful Alpha Kings, unforgettable heroines, and impossible choices that change destinies forever, subscribe to the channel and join us for this unforgettable journey. The village of Ashwell had always known Lydia as the woman who somehow found time for everyone else. At 28 years old, with long chestnut brown hair, warm hazel eyes, and a quiet smile that rarely asked for anything in return, she had become part of the village's daily rhythm. She helped elderly neighbors carry firewood before sunrise, sat beside sick children until their fevers passed, and somehow managed to bring comfort even to people who believed they were beyond hope. Kindness wasn't something she practiced. It was simply who she was, even when life gave her very little in return. Her own life was far from easy. Since her mother's passing years earlier, Lydia had cared for her aging father almost entirely on her own. Illness had stolen much of his strength, leaving him unable to work the fields that had supported their family for generations. Every day began before dawn and ended long after the lamps were lit, yet she never complained. Whenever neighbors apologized for asking too much of her, she answered with the same gentle smile her mother once wore: "Tomorrow always feels lighter when we help each other today." But Ashwell had been changing. 2 poor harvests had left many families struggling, and unfamiliar merchants had begun visiting the village more often than anyone could remember. Their promises sounded generous, yet every agreement seemed to leave another household carrying heavier burdens than before. Lydia noticed the growing worry on familiar faces, though few people spoke openly about it. Fear had quietly settled over the village long before anyone realized how dangerous it had become. Everything changed one rainy evening, when several respected members of the village council arrived at Lydia's cottage. Their expressions were unusually serious, and the conversation that followed made little sense to her. Questions were asked about documents she had never seen, meetings she had never attended, and decisions she had never made. Before leaving, they informed her that, until the matter was clarified, she would remain under the council's supervision. Her father tried to object, but his weakened voice carried little weight against men who believed they were protecting the village. By the next morning, whispers had spread through every street in Ashwell. People who had greeted Lydia warmly only a day before now looked away uncertainly, unsure what to believe. No one openly accused her, yet no one stepped forward to defend her either. The silence hurt more than the rumors themselves. Lydia searched familiar faces, hoping someone would simply ask her what had really happened. No one did. For the first time in her life, she understood how quickly trust could disappear when fear arrived first. Far beyond the village, news of the accusation reached the northern castle. The royal council expected the Alpha King to approve the village's decision without hesitation, just as any ruler eager to preserve order might have done. Instead, he quietly closed the report, looked toward the rain falling beyond the castle windows, and asked only one calm question: "Has anyone actually seen her commit the crime?" The room fell silent. No one had expected the investigation to begin with doubt instead of judgment. The following morning, Ashwell no longer felt like the village Lydia had known all her life. Doors that had once opened with warm smiles now closed a little too quickly as she passed. Conversations ended the moment she approached, replaced by uncomfortable silence and uncertain glances. No one shouted accusations anymore. They didn't have to. The distance people suddenly placed between themselves and her said far more than words ever could. Lydia realized that once fear settled into people's hearts, it often became easier to believe a rumor than to search for the truth. Her father watched everything from the small window of their cottage, carrying a guilt far heavier than his illness. "I should have protected you," he whispered one evening, unable to meet her eyes. Lydia gently placed her hand over his. "You have protected me my whole life," she answered softly. "Don't let this steal the years we still have together." Even now, when her own future had become uncertain, she found herself comforting the person who believed he had failed her. It was simply who she was. A few days later, members of the royal council arrived from the northern castle. They spoke politely, but every sentence carried the weight of authority. Until the investigation was complete, Lydia would accompany them to the castle, where the matter could be reviewed under the Alpha King's supervision. The villagers watched quietly as she prepared to leave. Some lowered their heads in sympathy. Others avoided looking at her altogether. No one knew whether they were saying goodbye to an innocent woman or to someone they believed they no longer recognized. The journey north lasted 2 days. Lydia spent most of it looking through the carriage window, watching familiar hills slowly disappear behind forests and mountains she had never crossed before. She wasn't afraid of the Alpha King himself. What troubled her was something much deeper. If even the people who had known her since childhood no longer believed in her, why would a man who had never met her think differently? At the northern castle, preparations for the inquiry were already underway. Council members reviewed reports, compared testimonies, and spoke confidently as though the conclusion had already been reached. Only one person remained unusually quiet. The Alpha King listened without interrupting, studying every statement with the patience of someone more interested in facts than assumptions. The longer the meeting continued, the more one detail continued to trouble him. Everyone seemed certain Lydia was guilty, yet no one could explain exactly how they knew. That evening, before the formal inquiry could begin, the Alpha King gave a single instruction to his advisors. Until the truth is clear, Lady Lydia will be treated as an honored guest of this castle, not as someone who has already been judged. The council exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, they realized this investigation might not end the way they had expected. Lydia expected cold walls, guarded corridors, and people watching her with suspicion wherever she went. Instead, she was shown to a quiet chamber overlooking the castle gardens, simple but comfortable, with fresh flowers resting beside the window. She looked around in confusion. Nothing about the room felt like punishment. When she asked the maid if there had been some mistake, the young woman simply smiled politely. These were the Alpha King's instructions. Lydia understood even less than before. The following days passed in unexpected silence. No one questioned her. No one pressured her to defend herself. She was free to walk through the gardens, visit the library, and explore the castle grounds, provided she remained inside the northern walls while the investigation continued. The servants greeted her with respectful nods, although many seemed curious about the woman whose arrival had quietly unsettled the entire royal council. Lydia tried to remain unnoticed, yet old habits followed her wherever she went. Before long, she was helping an elderly gardener gather fallen branches after a storm and comforting a frightened kitchen boy who believed he had ruined the evening meal. The Alpha King noticed every one of those moments without announcing his presence. More than once he watched from a distant balcony or a shaded corridor, saying nothing as Lydia offered kindness without expecting recognition. She never looked around to see who might be watching. She never tried to impress anyone. She simply responded to people the same way she always had. It reminded him of something his father had once told him. Character is easiest to see when no one believes it matters. One afternoon, Lydia wandered into the castle's old library, drawn by the quiet warmth of the room. She found the Alpha King there alone, studying maps spread across a long wooden table. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then he surprised her with the simplest of questions. "How is your father?" Lydia blinked, caught completely off guard. Out of everything happening around them, that was the last question she had expected. "You remembered him?" she asked softly. The Alpha closed the map before answering. A person's greatest worries often reveal more truth than any official report. Their conversation lasted far longer than either of them intended. They spoke about Ashwell, about difficult winters, about families who quietly carried burdens no one else noticed. Not once did he ask whether she was guilty. Not once did he demand explanations. Instead, he listened. For Lydia, it was the first conversation since the accusations began in which someone seemed genuinely interested in understanding who she was, rather than what others believed about her. When she finally returned to her chamber that evening, she realized something had changed. For the first time in many days, she no longer felt completely alone. Meanwhile, the investigation uncovered its first unexpected contradiction. A document that had supposedly proven Lydia's involvement had been signed several hours before. Witnesses claimed she had even arrived at the village meeting. It was a small detail, easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore. When the Alpha King placed the report on the council table, he spoke only one quiet sentence. "If one piece of the story is false, how much of the rest have we accepted without question?" Several days passed, and although the investigation continued, The castle itself seemed strangely different whenever Lydia walked through its halls. The servants no longer looked at her with uncertainty. They smiled when she entered the kitchens, greeted her in the gardens, and quietly thanked her for helping wherever she saw a need. Without realizing it, she had become part of the castle's daily life. She never tried to earn anyone's approval. She simply treated every person with the same kindness she had carried all her life. The Alpha King noticed the change long before anyone else did. One afternoon, while helping the royal archivist organize decades-old records, Lydia came across a collection of village ledgers that immediately caught her attention. Ashwell's name appeared several times, but the dates didn't make sense. According to the official records, several debts had already been settled months before the accusations against her had begun. Yet her father, and many other families, had continued receiving demands for payments they supposedly no longer owed. Lydia frowned. Somewhere, something wasn't adding up. She brought the documents to the Alpha King that same evening. He studied them carefully before calling his most trusted advisor. Together they compared the ledgers with the reports sent by the village council. The differences were impossible to ignore. Names had disappeared. Numbers had been altered. Entire pages seemed to tell different versions of the same story. It was no longer just a question of whether Lydia was innocent. Someone had carefully built a lie that reached far beyond one young woman. The Alpha ordered a quiet investigation, limiting the information to only a handful of people he trusted completely. He didn't want rumors spreading through the kingdom before the truth was fully understood. Watching him work, Lydia realized something she hadn't seen before. He wasn't simply trying to clear her name. He was trying to protect every family that might have suffered under the same deception. That realization changed the way she looked at him. Beneath the crown stood a man who carried responsibility far heavier than power. Late that night, one of the king's investigators returned from Ashwell with unexpected news. Several villagers had quietly admitted they never truly believed Lydia was guilty. They had remained silent because they feared challenging the village council, whose influence had grown stronger over the past year. Hearing those words filled Lydia with mixed emotions. She wasn't angry. Mostly she felt sadness. Fear had convinced good people to stay silent when someone needed them most. The Alpha King closed the final report and looked toward the fire burning in the library. If someone was willing to destroy an innocent woman's life to protect this secret— He paused, his expression growing more serious than Lydia had ever seen. Then we still haven't found the person we're really looking for. The investigation was moving faster now, and with every new discovery, more people inside the castle began looking at Lydia differently. Some apologized with quiet smiles. Others simply greeted her with a respect that hadn't existed when she first arrived. Yet none of it seemed to matter to her as much as everyone expected. She accepted every gesture with kindness, but never sought recognition. What occupied her thoughts wasn't her own reputation. It was the families back in Ashwell who still believed their future depended on a lie. Rather than waiting for the investigation to end, Lydia asked permission to help the royal relief workers preparing supplies for the northern villages. She spent her days packing blankets, sorting medicine, and writing the names of families who needed food before winter arrived. The servants often reminded her that she no longer needed to work. She only smiled. "If people are still struggling," she answered, "there's always something worth doing." Watching her from across the storeroom, the Alpha King found himself wondering how someone who had suffered so much could still think first about everyone else. A few days later, one of the king's investigators returned with the final pieces of the puzzle. The false records, the altered ledgers, and the misleading testimonies all pointed toward the same group of officials inside Ashwell's village council. For years they had manipulated debts, collected money that was never truly owed, and quietly blamed innocent families whenever questions began to surface. Lydia had never been their target because she was dangerous. She had simply become the easiest person to blame once someone needed a distraction. When the Alpha shared the truth with her, Lydia remained silent for a long moment. He expected anger. He expected relief. Instead, she asked something entirely different. What will happen to the families who trusted them? The Alpha looked at her in quiet disbelief. "You've just learned they tried to destroy your life." She lowered her eyes. "They also deceived people I love." At that moment, something settled inside him with complete certainty. Every report, every conversation, every quiet act of kindness had already led him toward the same conclusion. But hearing those words erased the last trace of doubt. Lydia wasn't extraordinary because she never suffered. She was extraordinary because suffering had never changed the person she chose to be. He realized then that the kingdom needed someone exactly like her, not simply because she was innocent, but because compassion remained her first instinct, even after betrayal. The next morning, the Alpha King summoned the Royal Council for one final assembly. "The investigation is complete," he announced. His grey eyes moved calmly across the chamber before resting on Lydia for the briefest moment. "And today, everyone will finally hear the truth." The great hall filled before sunrise. Council members, village elders, servants, guards, and representatives from Ashwell stood together beneath the banners of the Northern Kingdom, each waiting to hear the Alpha King's final decision. The silence carried none of the certainty that had filled the room days earlier. Too much had changed. Too many hidden truths had come to light. For the first time since Lydia's name had been spoken in accusation, every person present understood that this gathering was no longer about deciding her fate. It was about correcting a terrible mistake. One by one, the Alpha King presented the evidence gathered during the investigation. The altered records, the manipulated accounts, the false testimonies, and the decisions that had allowed fear to replace truth. No voices interrupted him this time. No one argued. Even those who had once believed Lydia was guilty lowered their eyes as the full story finally became impossible to deny. The village council members responsible for the deception were quietly removed from their positions, and new leaders were appointed to restore trust to Ashwell. Justice arrived without anger, without humiliation, and without revenge, only with the truth finally standing where the lies once had. When the gathering ended, Lydia's father slowly crossed the hall toward his daughter. His hands trembled as they always had since illness had stolen much of his strength, but this time they carried no shame. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking beneath the weight of everything he wished he had done differently. Lydia stepped forward before he could say another word and embraced him gently. "Let's not lose any more time looking backward," she said softly. "We still have tomorrow." Around them, many villagers quietly wiped away tears, realizing that forgiveness often required more courage than resentment ever could. Later that afternoon, the Alpha King walked beside Lydia through the castle gardens, where spring had finally begun to replace winter. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The investigation was over. Her name had been restored. She was free to return to Ashwell whenever she wished. At last he stopped walking and looked at her with the same calm honesty she had first seen in his eyes weeks before. "Everything that brought you here began with someone making decisions for you," he said quietly. "I won't make that mistake." He took a slow breath before continuing. "The gates of this castle will always remain open. Whether you leave, or whether you stay, will be entirely your choice." Lydia looked toward the distant mountains before turning back to him. She thought about the frightened woman who had first entered the castle believing everyone had already decided who she was. She thought about the people who had helped her, the friendships she had found, and the man who had been the first to seek the truth instead of accepting the easiest answer. Then, with a peaceful smile, she stepped closer and gently took his hand. "For the first time in my life," she said, "no one is choosing my future for me." Her fingers tightened around his. "And this time, I choose to stay." Months later, the people of Ashwell visited the northern castle, not because they feared its king, but because they trusted both the king and the woman who now stood beside him. Lydia never forgot the village where her story had begun, nor the lesson that had changed her life forever. A lie may travel quickly, and fear may silence even good people for a while, but kindness, truth, and the courage to believe in someone when no one else will always leave the deepest mark. The Alpha King did not choose Lydia because she was the strongest woman in the kingdom. He chose her because, when the whole world stopped believing in her, she never stopped being the woman she had always been. And in the end, that became the greatest strength of all. Under the same sky that once watched an entire village believe the worst about her, Lydia finally understood something she had spent her whole life forgetting. A person's worth is never decided by rumors, by fear, or by the opinions of those who stop looking for the truth. It is revealed by the choices they continue making when kindness becomes difficult and hope feels almost impossible to hold on to. The Alpha King could have accepted the easiest answer, just as everyone else had. Instead, he chose to listen before judging, to understand before deciding, and to believe that truth deserved more than a single glance. That one decision changed not only Lydia's future, but the future of an entire kingdom. Sometimes, the strongest leaders are not the ones who speak first, but the ones who refuse to condemn a good person without first knowing their heart. If you've ever felt misunderstood, unfairly judged, or overlooked when you needed someone to believe in you the most, remember Lydia's story. The right person won't define you by your worst day or by someone else's accusation. They will take the time to discover who you truly are. If stories about alpha kings, unforgettable heroines, and love built on trust, honor, and quiet courage have a place in your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Another unforgettable journey is already waiting, and we can't wait to share it with you.